So hello, everyone. I'm Nabil. I'll be your host for the evening. Thank you all for joining. I'm really looking forward to tonight's event. So as a quick intro to the meetup group for those of you who's it's your first time with Essence for Agility. Essentially, Essence for Agility is a community that's been around for almost 2 years now. I think it's a year and a half, approaching 2 years, which is really exciting. And you've probably guessed its aim is to explore Essence, which is a standard that describes all the practices within Agile methods to better enable us to pick the right set of practices to suit our context, regardless of which method they belong to. And a tagline that Ivar and co like to say is that it frees the practices from their method prisons. So that's a quick one-liner about what the group is about. And we've hosted many events on not just Essence, but all the topics within Agile, so we can create a more informed community. So we've got a great set of people tonight. I'll just give a very quick intro to them. We have Dave Farley, who is known for continuous integration, DevOps, automated testing, and generally building better software faster. We have Jeff Patton, the creator of Story Maps. We have Ian Spence, IC Agile co-creator of Essence at Ivar Jacobsen International. He's also been both a participant and attendee on previous events, so great to see him back. And we are meant to have Gabrielle Benefield, creator of MobiusLoop, with us today as well. But she is lucky or unlucky enough to be on a Greek island, and she doesn't have great internet connection. So she's going to do her best to join. But if she doesn't, then we'll just have to go with Dave, Jeff, and Ian. If she is able to join and she can find a reliable internet connection on her lovely utopian Greek island, then that would be great. So for those of you who are expecting to see Gabrielle, hopefully we will, but if not, then she sends her apologies and hopefully we'll catch her at the next event. And of course, we have Ivar, the man that needs no introduction. He will be joining us today as well, both as a host and contributing a little to the discussion. So those are the high-level intros out of the way. I'm going to hand over to Ivar now to kick us off.
Okay, I am going to show some slides here. So, okay. So first of all, I must say I'm really happy to have these panelists. I've been dreaming about having a panel like this and with these people. Dave and Jeff and Gabrielle, and of course Ian. Just to start off, my thinking was that we basically have a landscape of areas where we have ideas, techniques, practices, methods, whatever you call it. And I have just selected some names without any deeper thinking, just to give an idea. In this landscape, we want to make a journey, deliver something of value, maybe a product, a service, and that has a starting point and may have an endpoint, at least an intermediate endpoint. And on that journey, we need to use techniques, practices, yeah, you name it. And today we have many such ideas, small or big, and or let's say smaller or bigger. And they have, probably we have 50 such really being used ideas. I have just thrown up some of them. Of course, I put up the ones that the participants have created here, and put them just on the map. They are probably not put in the right area, but that is something we can fix. So the problem is, of course, that these are described in their own way, the way the author or creator came up with as the best way we could come up with. And they are therefore not so easy to penetrate. And that is what I would like to see as a discussion today. How do you select, how do you choose the journey for you on this, by selecting from a map like this? So welcome to let me know.
Great, thank you, Ivar. So I'll just stop there. I have some questions prepared for our panelists, but I just invite you guys to share any thoughts at this stage, Ian, Dave, or Jeff. Anything you'd like to share before we kick off to some of my questions?
I'll start. Good evening, everybody, or good afternoon, whatever your time zone. I think inevitably we're all going to be opinionated about this stuff, and we're going to have different takes on it. But I would see things in a slightly different way to the map that Ivar's shown. I think there are some overarching ideas that kind of help us to position those things, but I'm hoping that we're going to get into those and talk about those things. But I certainly think it's an interesting idea to try and figure out how we can understand the commonalities and the differences.
Brilliant, thank you, Dave. Any other thoughts?
I guess it was just me that was opinionated then.
I'm biting my tongue, Dave. So I'll toss in my opinion, and I think it'll resonate with yours. Whenever I see a linear model, I'm reminded that we're in the 21st century, and it doesn't seem like anything is linear anymore.
Yeah.
We're having this discussion over Zoom, and there's no new release of Zoom coming. Rather, most products continuously change in small improvements. And it's the way I draw process these days is always as a loop. And things keep getting smaller and faster. And we alternate from opportunity through to delivery faster than we ever used to. That changes things. It's not the way it was a couple decades ago when the term Agile was coined. Yeah, it's a different world.
I think that's one of those fundamental principles that I was kind of referring to, is that I would characterize modern software development as optimizing for feedback.
Yeah, it's more focused today on optimizing for feedback, for learning, for testing ideas and things like that. But now we're getting into the topics. We should look for some questions.
Okay, well, unless Ian has anything to share, then I'll jump in with my first question. Okay, so many organizations start with a framework such as SAFe, which comes bundled with a specific and large set of practices. How do you view this approach of getting practices from one source, i.e. the framework such as SAFe, versus an approach of pulling them together from different sources? So I will go to Ian to kick us off, since he has yet to share his thoughts. And I hope that's okay, Ian.
I was expecting to be the last person on this one, as the only person who is accredited, uses and likes various frameworks. For me, the thing about frameworks is a couple of things. One, what is their purpose? All right. The purpose of the framework is to help you fit things together and to accelerate your journey. And in all cases, when you're picking frameworks, practices, whatever, context is king. Right? Every pattern misapplied is an anti-pattern. Right? But I have been involved in many successful SAFe engagements. I'm the SAFe Fellow. I've done Scrum at Scale with Jeff Sutherland. I have turned to the dark side in the past, a long time ago. Eva and I had long discussions about whether we should write our own one, which we thought was a bad idea. We thought there was enough of them around. But that was a precursor to the work on Essence. But then there's the relationship between the framework and practices. A framework would be incomplete, right? And some frameworks, like Scrum at Scale, have very little in them, or even Scrum itself, which some people consider to be a framework, has very little in it. Then you have to fill in all of the holes, right? The framework may not cover the whole space. I mean, there is a need for financial governance and financial responsibility in the world of software. There is a need to be able to do CapEx and OpEx. So there's financial frameworks, there's other things than just the software development going on. And when it comes to frameworks, I know a lot of people like to kick safe because they like to kick things that are successful. They used to kick RUT back in the day, Evo, didn't they? And stuff. But I've had people say, when people do safe, they do the wrong thing. And they do it even though safe tells them not to do it, right? So if they hadn't been told not to do it, would they have not done it? You know? So when you have these frameworks, they help you understand gaps in your knowledge and how things fit together. And you've got to weigh up whether it's a good idea that they come with a default practice, in the case with safe, or they come with big holes in, as the case with other stuff. I mean, I agree with Dave, continuous delivery is incredibly important. And if you drill down, you'll find that is fundamental to many of these frameworks, right? But how do you combine those things with things like financial governance? I've seen companies make huge mistakes because they think they're doing Agile, everything is OpEx, so they stop capitalizing anything, or they go the other way and they capitalize too much. And if you get those things wrong, you can end up with the government coming down on you and things like that. So I think we need to put them into perspective and use them when and where they're going to help. But don't think they're your end goal. All right? Agile is about inspect and adapt. So if you're doing everything by the defaults, after you've done it a couple of years, you're probably doing it wrong, and that holds for all of them. So that's my tuppence halfpenny worth, Nabil.
Thank you so much. Dave and Jeff, any thoughts on your side?
Do you want to go, Jeff, or shall I?
Go ahead, Dave. You pipe in.
Okay. So first of all, let's set the scene. We're talking amongst friends here. We all think that the idea of inspect and adapt is central. And one of the reasons why it's central, to my mind, I'm a technologist. I think in terms of science and engineering and those sorts of ideas. I think that the step from what went before to agile thinking was a step in the direction of a more scientifically defensible way of dealing with things. And so the practical application of science is kind of engineering. And so it's a step in the direction of stronger engineering. Inspect and adapt is central to that idea. That's a fundamental kind of tenet of taking a scientific way of discovering new knowledge. So I think that's important. So I would agree entirely on that. I think that where I would slightly disagree is the role of frameworks. That the problem with most frameworks is that they tell you what to do. And I think that there are other ways of giving you guidelines. So I can state the guidelines of continuous delivery in very few words. And if you can achieve this, I don't care how you achieve it, you will be in my view, and I think the evidence is doing a better job. So continuous delivery is working in a way so that your software is always in a releasable state. And you're going to evaluate it to the degree that you understand that it's releasable at least once a day. If you can do that, whatever the scale of your software, you're in good shape. And I don't care whether you're doing stand-up meetings. I don't care whether you're doing release trains, although that's unlikely given the rate of feedback that we're looking for. That's a different kind of constraint to saying do these things. And that's my nervousness with frameworks. There are often good ideas in frameworks. I certainly wouldn't dispute that. One of my favorite ideas, or something that I'm profoundly linked with in people's minds, I think, is the idea of continuous integration, test-driven development, those sorts of extreme programming practices, which I think are very, very good tools. But I go back to my earlier statement. If you can determine the releasability of your system at least once per day, definitively, you're in good shape. And I don't care how you achieve that. And I think that's important, to give that freedom to change the way that you work, adapt to what's coming down the stream. And this is more like the kind of guide rails that I think that we apply in other fields of engineering and science. It's not about saying this is the answer. It's about ruling out dumb answers. If we start taking a more engineering approach, and I think that's the thing that I would be striving to achieve.
Very well put. Thank you so much, Dave. Jeff, over to you.
Yeah, I'm trying to decide how much. I think the problem is always people. We to learn something, we use recipes. We follow instructions, and we look for shortcuts. An old friend of mine said, experts don't follow rules. The rules are there to turn beginners into experts. Frameworks give us a good starting point, but sometimes we forget it's a starting point. Sometimes we forget that context, I think Ian said, context matters a lot. Behind those frameworks are principles that guide us, and it's up to us to be alert, to recognize where we are, to make changes where appropriate. And I think all of us have seen, and you hinted at it, no matter what, despite the warnings that SAFe might give, people still follow recipes blindly. That starts to be the big tension. That starts to be the big problem.
Or they don't follow them.
Yeah, they don't follow. Yeah, exactly. They don't follow them, and despite warning labels, they do the wrong things with them. And at the end of the day, we're fighting human nature to some degree. I think we all want a shortcut. We all want a simple way to. We all want something simple to follow to get us up and running. We all want to figure out why things are going wrong, and if we can have some rules to point to and say you broke the rules or you didn't follow the rules, that's good. But I don't know. I don't know if I have too much to add. Just there's some the challenge with recipes and with frameworks is that people end up blindly following. I wish we were a lot stronger about saying the goal of this recipe is not to follow the recipe, is to start with the recipe and then be alert and improvise, make changes, make adaptations, improve on it.
And Dave, you'll be pleased to know I do know Agile release trains over 1,000 people, continuously available software. Right. So, and that's what the framework. But just as an amusing aside, a long time ago, when we started All the Essence, I did some work with one of the world's major software corporations who were promoting their own framework at the time. And by analysing it and breaking it down into practices, within a day, we proved that if you followed it, you would fail. Right? And they said, well, that's okay because no one follows it. Right? Yeah. So some of these things are just PR material. So not all the stuff out there actually fits together. And if you do what they say, you will get a result. If you adopt the framework,
that's my thing. I think so. My thing is that I think that we should be striving to understand and define what engineering means for software. And engineering is, the practices that allow us to do a better job. So if it doesn't allow us to build better software faster, that's not engineering. That doesn't count. So there are practical ways of kind of defining what that means. And if we apply that kind of reasoning, that allows us to rule out some of the dumb ideas. So for example, feature branching is a practice that works well if you've got a not very good development process, but it's counter to the kinds of things that we're talking about. It puts a barrier in a way of getting us visibility into what's really going on, of the truth of our systems, to be able to test those in more deterministic, more predictable, more reliable ways. And so there are a variety of practices that we can rule out if we start to take a slightly harder line on what it means to draw some of these boundaries. And I think those principles are actually few and in some ways more straightforward, but they're better guide rails than, say, have a stand-up meeting at the start of the meeting. Those are reasonable advice, or divide your stuff up into release trains or whatever it might be. I just think those practices they're kind of one flavor of an answer to a deeper question. And I think that exposing the deeper question forms the better guide rails.
So I think there is a fundamental problem that's gone wrong in the method space. Is all the attention has been on work management, all the practice, all the attention, and not on good software engineering practices.
Yes.
Right. I was working at a customer. People come out of university now and they don't know how to do developer testing, unit testing, things like that. And, a lot of the stuff we have available, our agile practices, don't go anywhere near that stuff.
Yes.
And I think it's because it's a shame that we are not codifying those practices, have a big fight about how we're going to manage the work, forget how we're going to do our testing, for example.
Yes. And I think that your point that there's more to it than only writing code or whatever. There are the issues of working in regulated environments and managing safety critical systems and so on and all of that sort of stuff. But that's all part of the discipline of engineering. That's the things that we can do, and we can apply this kind of thinking to as well. And it works. This is the way of building safer systems, by working in smaller steps in fast feedback cycles like Jeff was talking about earlier, and so on, and learning more quickly.
Okay, so that was a fascinating discussion. I suggest we continue it with my next question. In the invite of this meetup event, in the description, one of the things we said is that some of these practices or techniques uniquely address a specific aspect of the development lifecycle. Others may overlap or compete head to head, while some complement each other seamlessly. So kind of thinking back to Ivar's map and to this quote, how can we understand how they overlap or how they complement each other? Or more generally, how do they relate to one another so a team can select the right stuff for their context? Maybe Jeff, you'd like to kick us off with your thoughts here?
Ouch, what a tough one. I don't know if I've got a good answer here. It's all of these are tools. They're ways of thinking. They're ways of performing a craft. And you see a craftsman do great work with one tool and argue that this is the best tool, and then another craftsman do great work with a completely different tool and argue it's the best tool. It has a lot more to do with the craftsperson behind using the tool. I focus on the story mapping thing, and I'll use story mapping to make sense of or build shared understanding about the problems we're solving. So we use it to analyze things, opportunities out front, or we'll construct maps of solutions. I'll use the structure of the map to construct release strategies. So for me, that's my tool, and that hammer I'm going to use everywhere. And sometimes I'm blind to other tools that might fit in there. How you discover what tools fit where, there's something in there about proficiency. There's something in there about how good you are at using the tool. When I'm teaching somebody how to use something new and it doesn't work for them, I'll remind them it's not that the tool doesn't work, it's just that you suck at it. It's tough to evaluate a tool in the absence of the craftsperson using it. I don't know, and that makes the situation doubly hard of figuring out how the tools fit together. It's practice, or the practice process is not skill. Skill is something different. Not helpful.
No, that was a great answer. Ian or Dave, do you have anything to share?
I could share a few things. One of the things that Essence does is it does give you, as Ivar hinted at on his map with the opportunity, it does give you 3 views of the space of software engineering. Right, the things that you need to do, underlying concepts you need for software engineering. And this allows you to take whatever practices and things you've got and see whether they are overlapping or complement each other. And you can do that. There's some gamification that allows you to look at these things, look at the concentration and the spread of stuff. So, you know, you could add Scrum to the game board and you'd see it doesn't tell you how to do anything about actually building your software. Right? So there's some useful things in essence, and as it matures, and people do more sophisticated practices in essence, we may be able to get into the competition, right? And what that means. Having multiple practices in the same space isn't a bad thing, because as Jeff said, some of them may be for beginners, right? Some of them may be for different things. You've got to remember who the practice is aimed at, because a lot of the guidance is to help you learn. I mean, I do a lot of rollouts and training, and people are often at the most dangerous when they've just been trained, because they haven't got any skills yet. They haven't got they're armed and dangerous, right? They've got to practice doing it and build up examples of their work before you can say whether they're doing it well. One of the big struggles people have is when things are complementary and not competing, right? And what you're going to give precedence as well. A lot of organizations that have adopted Agile have created a kind of an Agile Tower of Babel, where you go around a company, everyone is saying different words, and sometimes they mean the same thing and sometimes they mean different things, and some of them are important. And Essence gives you a bit of that common ground as well. So certainly something Essence can help with, Bill. Not so good on the competing. It's not so good at saying, actually, in your situation, this one would be better than that one. That's left to the user for now. One day, maybe we'll have some evidence and stats and things like that.
So I think we have a little bit of the evidence and the stats for that in terms of the DORA metrics. So I think that the DORA metrics are an important, useful tool for evaluating the efficacy of the choices that we make. So the DORA metrics, if anybody's not familiar, are measures of stability and throughput. We measure stability by the change failure rate and the mean time to recovery, and we measure throughput by lead time, the time from a commit to releasability, and the frequency with which you act on the releasability of those things. With teams that score highly on both of those measures, those behaviors are very, very highly correlated. In fact, they are predicted. They predict things like those teams will be spending 44% more time on new features than teams with low scores, and that the organizations that employ those teams will be making more money. So those are pretty good measures that we can use. I think in my own stuff, I have a book. I'm sorry to advertise my book, but it's called Modern Software Engineering, which is trying to talk about the principles of what software engineering ought to be. In it, I divide it into 2 groups of 5 principles. I think that ours is a discipline of learning. And in order to be good at learning, we need to be iterative, incremental, experimental, empirical, and I've forgotten the 5th one right now. The other set of principles are that we're going to manage complexity. We build complex systems. Software development is not an easy job, and it's never going to be cookie cutter. It's always going to require sophisticated intelligence to do it well. Certainly, anybody can write a simple HTML page, but if we're talking about complex systems, it is hard. This is world-class difficult. And so in order to be able to do that, we need to manage complexity. And for that, we need the ideas like modularity, cohesion, separation of concerns, reducing coupling and abstraction in order to be able to defend ourselves and maintain our ability to keep, going back to what Jeff said, iterating fast and learning from it. And I think those are principles that we can use to evaluate any idea. Does this change? Does this particular practice compromise our ability to work experimentally, or does it enhance our ability to iterate more quickly? Does it allow us to produce more modular systems? For example, I would argue strongly that test-driven development amplifies our ability to create more modular, more cohesive software with better separation of concerns that's loosely coupled and abstract. So it amplifies the ability, these abilities. So I think that those principles give us a measuring stick that we can use to evaluate any of these ideas at whatever scale that we want to practice them, and then choose which practices we want to adopt and which we don't. And then we can measure the impact of those using the DORA metrics, for example, to determine whether we're on track or not.
Fascinating. Ian or Jeff, do you have anything to add?
I would add, from an essence perspective, one of the challenges, and originally there was a track on measurement that never came to anything, is we've got definitions for the concepts that we're handling, right? But we haven't got those measurement practices. And we certainly don't have measurement practices that are decoupled from the other bits of practice that have got in there. And one of the powerful things with Essence and the alphas is they do give you some points of stability you can measure regardless of practices. And it'd be interesting to beef up some of that stuff around, complex systems and stuff that Dave's talking about. The challenge is to do it without then telling people what they should be doing to drive this measure.
That's in a way the measures that I'm talking about are really quite abstract. They don't say anything about technology or really practice. They just say, I think if I'm being brutally honest against my own interests in this discussion, I think that you can say that the choice of the DORA metrics is kind of a little bit slanted towards continuous delivery. I think there was a little bit of, let's show that continuous delivery works in choosing these metrics. But I find it, nevertheless, I think that they're quite decoupled and they are applicable to almost anything. And ultimately, if we can't build better software faster, what's the point? And that's what they're doing. They're measuring that it's better and faster. So they're not bad on that front.
Was somebody about to talk?
No, please go ahead, Jeff.
Okay, I'll add something to this. I spend most of my career, I teach product stuff, and I'll use the language system that I'll lean on is output, outcome, and impact. Output is what we build and how fast we build it and whether it was on time. Outcome is whether the thing we built actually gets used. If we don't use the thing that we built, if it doesn't get used, and if we don't measure that, if we build something and no one uses it, I promise you it's not valuable. And then I'll use impact to look at the consequences of that use. You deliver new functionality, usage is an outcome, and business impact is the return on an investment that comes as a consequence of that. It doesn't matter what practices we use, how on time we deliver. It's the measuring is the hard part for a lot of organizations, measuring whether we actually did get value out of what we're doing. And when I look at guiding principles for process and tool selection, it's always focused on that. It's focused on outcome and impact. That's where the value comes from. And in most organizations, we're really crap at measuring those things. We fall back on measuring whether we can deliver faster. The DORA metrics, Dave, that you mentioned, those, if we optimize around those, now we've got a responsive machine. But those DORA metrics are in service of measuring the value that comes out of that machine. That's the hard part, is moving both organizations to focus on that, people to focus on that. But sometimes that's the thing that, if we go all the way back to the process framework discussion, that's one of the guiding principles for me is who's accountable for the value, how do we measure that value? And when I don't see that strong in a process framework, I get pretty anxious. That's our purpose for doing things here.
I'd agree with that very strongly, and what the things that I outlined aren't all that there is for that very reason. Yeah, I think that the problem with that with that measurement problem is the reason why it's a problem is it's always so contextual. You know, it's dependent on the nature of the change that you're making. One kind of change, I might be worrying about what's the user sign up. You know, how many more users am I getting as a result of this change? Another change, I might be worrying about what's the latency of this, because this is a trading system or something like this. There are all those kind of things. And so, as part of what I mean by working experimentally is that part of doing the work, we decide what our units of what our measurements should be for this piece of work. And that's another one of the experiments that we're carrying out and monitoring the results of those as part of our work. That's another reason why continuous delivery, working in small batches, gives us the opportunity to have more of those kinds of experiments too.
So, really fascinating discussion. I'm curious what your approach is to determine the autonomy teams have when selecting their practices or techniques. Do you typically advocate they have free rein? Are there some sort of guardrails you put in place, or is there something else? Maybe Ian, you'd like to kick us off with this?
I've got to go last next time. Anyway, there's always going to be some constraints from the context that you're living. Don't fall for all of the Agile hogwash. There are many people using Agile to do evil things. Right? We'll talk about some of these companies and how great they are, but they've never made any money. Most of their staff on 0-hour contracts. So you need to have some way to connect the teams into the culture, the values and principles, and you need to have some way to connect them in to, teams will be part of something bigger, some kind of owning organization. So you need some way to plug all those things up. I mentioned the sort of Agile Tower of Babel. It's not transparency if nobody else can understand what you're doing without reading a textbook. So you need to get some common vocabulary, some common terminology, and a lot of Agile coaches need to get over themselves and just go, okay, over here I'm prepared to call that X, because they're basically the same thing. There's more in common between these things. And if you can get the measurement frameworks go for the DORA type stuff, but the outcomes and impacts as well, you can have some objective evaluation of how the teams are doing, which allows them to do experiments around what practices they use. So I've tended to call that thread through. You need some kind of common operating model, right? And it will provide places to plug these things. So I've done a lot of work where teams can choose their work management stuff, but they have to use a certain vocabulary about their work items, right? And there are some constraints as well about the size of batches and stuff like that. But beyond that, we don't care very much, as long as we can get some accountability in there. So I have done a large Agile rollout at an organization where they used SAFe, they used Nexus, they used Less, they had made up some of their own, right? And they all coexisted happily because the join bit was well defined and gave them that freedom to play around. But there was a much more focus on the kind of metrics Dave's talking about and things like that. But also looking at scatter and all the other things. So that's sort of my take on it. There's a great slide by Henrik, and I can't pronounce his name. Sorry to any Scandinavians. How do you really say it, Ivo? You're Swedish.
You say it in the way you say ni. You don't pronounce K, and his name is Niberg.
Niberg, you see, I'd get the wrong bit on the end. Anyway, he has a great slide about a little person on a little cairn of rocks tottering between the sharp stakes of bureaucracy and the fires of chaos. Right? So you need to get something that allows you to execute all the different dimensions compatibly, but give people the freedom then to pick the practices within those things. So if they want to do, maybe they could do use cases or stories or story maps, but there needs to be something that holds it together for reporting and other purposes.
Great, thank you.
To build on that, I'll spend a lot of time sometimes reminding people that processes like Scrum get their name from playing a team sport. I don't know much about rugby, but I know we sort of need to agree on the rules of the game we're playing. We've got a lot of teams playing. If we say we're playing football and you say that to an American, a German, and an Australian, you might get 3 different games. But we want to agree on what the rules of the game we're playing are, and we want teams to be able to play together. It doesn't take a team to build a product. It takes teams of teams and lots of them, and those teams need to work in orchestration. So I agree. We kind of need to have common language. We need to share rules of the game, but teams need to have their own flexibility about their specific strategies and tactics. And sometimes the practice they choose at a particular time is has a tactical advantage for them at the time. So we don't want to mandate some. There's some. You look for the connective practices, the things that allow teams to work together, and we look for common language so you can move from team to team. But it's the, like you said, Ian, it's the balance. It's not too much towards bureaucracy or too much towards chaos. And it's always, I remember the old, oh shoot, is it D Hawk that now I am old, but use the term chaotic. Somewhere between chaos and order is the right thing, and that's the chaotic term, if you've heard that word before. That's what we're looking for, something in between.
There's so many things to talk about on this question, but I think that one of the things that we seem to often forget is that human systems are information systems too. So the rules of managing complexity in human systems are very, very closely related to the rules of managing complexity in software systems. So we need to manage the coupling, the modularity, the cohesion, and all of those kinds of things too. If we know we're built as tribal animals, there are biological limits on our ability to cope at different scales. There's things called the Dunbar numbers that say things get more complicated. I think it's about 150 people. You get over 150 people, everything goes to chaos. And you can kind of see this in all sorts of places. Like companies that transition from being 150 people or smaller to bigger face all sorts of horrible problems. And usually that's the point at which they start adding more and more bureaucracy, going slower and doing all sorts of things. So there are some limits on what we can do. There's some lovely studies on the size of software development teams. I'm going to just metadata studies based on the rate at which you produce 100,000 lines of code. If you do that measure, teams of 20 people and more are nearly 4 times less productive than people of 5 times and fewer. So one of the things is nearly always in software, we add too many people. Fred Brooks said in the 1970s that was a dumb idea, but it's a dumb idea that we're still doing. When we do need to build software at scale, and we need to do it with more people, then what we need is autonomy matters. So we need small teams in the range of kind of 5 to 9 people. And we need to organize things so that mostly they can make progress independently of other teams. But as everybody said, it's vital to be able to collaborate and to be able to communicate. So that's where the coupling comes in. It's not that these are going to be disconnected from the world. It's that they are loosely coupled with respect to other teams. So they have the capabilities within the teams that they need, and they're able to make progress forward. My favorite thing on this, I think one of the more important books that's been published in the last maybe decade, I don't know, but certainly recently, is Team Topologies, which talks about these ideas of how you design and structure teams and manage the relationships between them to minimize the coupling, in essence, is the way that I would frame it, to keep the teams small and autonomous. And it gives lots of advice on ways to do that. I think that's really important. But it's kind of surprising. So Tesla, people would point at Tesla as being a good example of doing a good job of software development alongside the engineering of their cars and so on. There are only about 400 software developers at Tesla. You look at BMW or somewhere like that, and there are tens of thousands.
Yes.
That's interesting.
Very interesting.
Oh, the first rule of scaling is don't scale.
Yes, absolutely. I was involved in building a financial exchange. I was the head of software development, and I spent a significant proportion of my time, me and the CTO spent a significant proportion of our time playing defensive blocks against the rest of management who wanted to grow the team too big. We were desperately trying to keep our team small so that we could move quickly.
Very insightful. If there's no other follow-ups to that question, I have my final question for you guys before we hand over to the audience. So maybe just very briefly, I would like to know your thoughts on how important it is to standardize practices in an organization, department, or a team of teams setting. Maybe Jeff, you could kick us off.
Yes, but where to set the dial is hard. Again, go back to what Dave said. It's the coupling and cohesion. We want teams to be able to play together and exchange information, and we kind of standardize around the boundaries. I'm reminded, an old person that used to live close by was a guy named Jim Highsmith, and I remember him saying that you want to go let process be as small as you can tolerate, and then go a little bit smaller than that. So slightly less than you can tolerate was the secret here. So yeah, standardize, but go as light as you can. Maybe to some place that's sort of uncomfortable, and look around the edges. Look at how teams are communicating with each other, and look at how teams are exchanging information, collaborating with each other. That's where you kind of want to. That's where you want to standardize or share common practice. Standardize is an ugly word. But I have no idea what that standard looks like. So I'll stop there.
Should we let Ian go last this time?
Yeah.
So I would agree with that. I would tend to err on the side of less process. I saw something recently, and I can't for the life of me remember what it was properly. But essentially, what it was saying is that you want fewer rules and you adopt them rigidly. So you stick to you have fewer rules, but you stick to them. It's much better than having lots of rules and kind of half obeying them. And I think that's one of the problems with the bigger, more complicated frameworks and approaches. In some ways, there's too much stuff in there, and people get confused. And so, paring it down to more straightforward, sort of narrower guidelines and rules in terms of the process is good. Once you set those off, we are human beings, and if we establish these small autonomous teams and genuinely allow them to be autonomous, it is inevitable that they will diverge. If they don't, they're doing it wrong. And so there's a degree to which a certain tolerance for difference is important. So what an organization needs to do that's doing something, at some scale, is to decide what are the things that are important, and that must what are those rules that must be adhered to? If I'm working in a finance system or building medical devices or whatever else it is, then, or safety critical systems, then, it's essential that every team is working within some regulatory constraints. Otherwise, we go out of business or we kill people. And so, that sort of stuff needs to be somehow provided. And then the job of an organization that's trying to do a good job is to try and minimize the impact of that stuff on people's everyday work. So we get into the team topologies idea of platform teams or enabling teams that facilitate other teams to do the work and focus on the business impact stuff while making sure that the line of business is maintained.
I'm going to soapbox here, but in talks years ago, I had a book, a physical book. I had a Football for Dummies book. It's an American football it was talking about, but the book was nicely organized. The first part of the book was about the rules of the game, and the remaining part of the book was about strategies and tactics. I put a bookmark in it, and I wanted people to see that it was the first quarter, maybe a little bit more, that were the rules of the game, and the remaining 2/3 to 3/4, those were strategies and tactics. Those are the things that varied. The rules of the game were relatively light compared to all the things that individual teams had the ability to control and change and things like that. That felt like the right balance for me.
So just to build on that, when we talk about standard practices, right, I think it's nice that if someone tells me they're doing something, they actually mean they're doing what they say they're doing, right? I like that. That doesn't mean everybody has to do it. I just get annoyed when people say, we have failed doing practice X, but we never actually did it, right? We broke it and then we failed and then we blamed it, right? That annoys me no end. When you get into an organization, as Jeff said, you need to know what are the rules of the games. It ties back to those measurements, right? How do we generate alignment and things like that? I think it was Deming said that if left alone, the components of the system will become competitive and ultimately destroy the system. Mm-hmm. That can happen in the people system as well as the other kinds of stuff that's going on. So in organizations, you need to know what are the rules of the games, what are these important things. But you've also got to have some kind of organizational memory, because a lot of people, when they start changing their way of working, throw the baby out with the bathwater. And there are things that have been there because this is what you do when something horrible happens. And it hasn't happened for a while, so no one's got any experience of that. So they throw that stuff away, and then something horrible happens, and they go, I wish I knew what to do. It's the same with the skills, right? You need the people who, they've mastered the practice, can go beyond it when the turmoil gets tricky. But yeah, this idea of sort of the common operating model, the rules of the game, the measurements as well, if you make it outcome-based stuff that you're insisting on. You can do what's interesting. Things like process assurance and QA are fascinating, because a lot of the people who do these things don't seem to understand what they're doing. So at one organization, we did do basically an Essence kernel-based QA process where we assessed what they'd achieved, and then they said whether they did it using the practice that they were supposed to or not. And if they had used a different one and been more successful, that was great. Look at the outcomes first. But then you say, maybe this is something that other people should benefit from sharing, right? But other places, we tried something different and it went horribly wrong. So think about those things. So the rules of the game, particularly if you can measure it, so you know what winning the game would look like. And you've got to get this balance between the commercial aspects, the product aspects, the continuous delivery aspects as well. I know people who do continuous delivery of always the wrong thing. And they go, it doesn't matter, we can do the next thing. Now, at some point you must learn from these experiments, and maybe there's a problem a little bit back down there. So, getting the rules of the game out. And every practice will have some rules of the game, and then it have lots of additional stuff that you can plug in and things like that. So if we can get that kind of growth framework, one of the things Scrum has done very well is keep itself light and focus on a set of rules. Is Scrum the solution to everyone's problems? No. All right. Do I get annoyed with people who have been doing stuff for so long and they've got a great team and they know it and they think their little semi-organized chaos is what everyone else should do? Yes. All right. But it's good to know if people are doing Scrum, they're doing it, but there's other things as well. You could debate nearly everything. Most people in Agile like stable teams, small stable teams. That's good for throughput. It's not that good for innovation. Innovation benefits from diversity and people coming together in new things. So context is king to people. But yeah, I like standard practices, Nabil, but I don't think you should mandate that many of them. There's a difference between saying if you're in this situation, we recommend you do this, and if you do it, here are the rules. It's very different from saying everyone will do this regardless of what you're doing. Right?
Thank you so much for the insightful answers. I really appreciate you guys taking the time to answer some of my questions. But I'm conscious I've hogged the spotlight for a long time with my questions, so I'm curious to hear what the audience have for you. So maybe we could spend the next 5 or 10 minutes covering any questions that the audience have. So feel free to use the raise hand feature in Zoom if anyone has a question. I think there's one already in the chat. So Virginio, would you like to unmute and ask your question? Or if not, I can ask it on your behalf. Going once. Please, I ask. Okay. So while I ask the question, feel free to, again, use the raise hand or just paste your question in the chat. So the question Virginio has for you panelists is, context always matters when choosing the right tool and framework. In these sense, I like the explore, expand, extract model from Kent Beck, where he defines different phases of product development. Each phase is a different game with different rules. In this model, you probably could argue that the test-driven development would be an anti-pattern in the explore phase, where in the expand phase, it would be a good choice. Do you think that models like the 3X could help in choosing the right tools and practices?
I can give my view on that one. Is that specifically in the question in the example that you chose, then no, I think TDD is a remarkably good tool in the explore space, but that's just the way that I use it. So I won't take that any further. I think that, yeah, that there are different practices that may work in different in the different phases. So it's kind of a guideline, but it's one of a few. And yeah, there are going to be differences that when we're working, when we're in pure discovery mode. But I think that modern software development is more like always in pure discovery mode. I think that the explore, expand, and extract model is a little bit like old-fashioned thinking. I feel embarrassed to be saying that about Kent Beck, because I'm a big fan of his thinking on the whole. But I think it is a little bit. I think that we don't build complex things by having a genius idea spring from our minds, and then we work very hard to build it, and then we let it out into the wild and relax and think that's a good job, well done. Software is not like that. Software is something that we tend throughout its life and manage and grow and evolve over time. And so we are always in each of those modes. And if we're sensible, we're going through that loop of explore, expand, and extract really quickly. And optimizing to do that quickly is the game, to my mind. So working so that we sustain our ability to do that is kind of part of the working. So I think that those are all part of what we're doing, or should be, all of the time. I think that's what I mean when I say that software is about learning, really, is that we should be working to optimize our ability to keep changing things, because we kind of keep getting things wrong. Nearly everything we do is going to be, for the first time, is probably wrong. So we want to be able to maintain our ability to go back and question it and say, that was wrong. Let's notice when it's wrong and let's correct it. Now we've got more information.
I'll build on that. The Kent's explore, expand, extract model is sort of based around, there's always been a 4-step product lifecycle model. In old days, it was introduction, growth, maturity and decline. And these days, the model we use is explore, exploit, sustain, retire. But traditional products go through that model. My coffee machine goes through that model. But traditional products replace themselves with an obsolescence model. The manufacturer will work on a new coffee machine, and then I throw mine away and replace it. But tech products don't go through that model. We're using Zoom, and Zoom is ideally not going to be retired. They'll continuously improve that product. And as a result, Zoom itself could be considered in sustain mode or extract mode in Kent's model. But as Zoom introduces new capabilities to that product, that capability might be in explore or exploit mode. We grow and shrink products by adding capabilities, and yeah, where you are in the life cycle of your product as a whole and the life cycle of that capability certainly informs your strategies and practices. It's super valuable to be mindful of that. So the short answer of that is, yep, be mindful of that. But the other thing, the other cautionary thing is tech products evolve continuously, and one part of the product might be in one phase while the whole of the product might be in another phase.
Oh. Nabil could give you a nice story about how practices have to change in a specific organization when they go from being a purely experimental scientific endeavor to launching a highly secure, robust and reliable blockchain system. Yeah. There's a significant state change in a lot of the practices that need to do. I had the pleasure of doing some work at Google. And if you know about Google, not that many of their things make it. Right? Their attrition rate on nowadays is incredibly high. And some of the people there have never taken anything over that transition. And their practices, yeah, those are fine for what you're doing now. But once you get it, you're going to have to up some of the software engineering staff and have other things and looking at that. Now, hopefully, you can reduce the time between the initial idea and getting stuff out there, MVPs and stuff like that. But some of these big endeavors, like, the thing Dfinity have been building, there's a substantial amount of stuff needed before you can launch it. But there will be those changes. The thing that gets me, it's not so much the change, it's that people get complacent. They get to the nice place where things are working nicely and think they've mastered everything. Right? They forget how they got there, and they forget how horrible it will be the next time nasty things happen. So you've got to continually, as they said, you need those measures. You need to trend and have things that tell you, this is heading in the wrong direction, right? People in the chat were discussing, it's good to deploy a lot of stuff, but not if it's the wrong stuff, right? So you've got to get a balance between these things, but there will be changes. There'll be changes in the financial status as well. I mean, I'm doing a lot of work around lean portfolio management and stuff at the moment. And it's amazing how some of those small decisions at the team level can break the economics for the thing they were building, right? Because they've taken their eye off the ball. So yeah, there will be. I'm not familiar with that model of Kent's, but as Jeff was saying, now we have emergent systems built out of many stuff. When you're doing cloud computing and all this, your actual system, you may build very little of it yourself and things like that. So there's a whole lot of interesting stuff in that area as well.
Awesome. Thank you guys.
Context is everything.
Context is king. Thank you so much. I'm sure Virginio appreciated the responses. Jonah, you sent me a private message with a question. Would you like to ask it yourself, or shall I ask on your behalf? It would be nice to hear from other people, but you said go for it, so I'll ask it myself. Jonah asks, what are the measurements that can be used to validate that you have released working software in production, being used and solving a problem, apart from actually having a conversation with an end user or checking usage metrics? So what other ways can you validate that you've done the right thing, if I interpret the question correctly?
I think that's hugely contextual and depends on the nature of the change. One of the models that I like a lot is the site reliability engineering model. I take it a tiny step further than is normally used in talking about that, in that I would add business measures as well as the technical measures. That when everybody thinks about site reliability engineering, not surprisingly, they think about sites reliabilities and engineering. But the model itself is just really about experimentation. So part of site reliability engineering is that as part of any piece of work, you decide, everybody decides, the people representing the business, the people representing the technology, and they're all on the same team usually, ideally, and they're going to have a conversation, people representing operations, and they're going to have a conversation about, okay, so how are we going to measure the success of this idea? What's the scale that we're going to measure it on? And what do we think is a good measure on that scale? And then we're going to have an error budget. How much of a budget over a time period, how many divergences from that success criteria are we going to accept? That's quite a nice experimental practice to carry out ideas. If you take that just that little step further and not just do that for things like CPU usage or disk space, and apply it to other things like user sign up, user referral, profit that we're making off some particular feature or whatever it might be, then that's a genuine experimental practice for playing not just with the technology, but with our product ideas. But it's hugely contextual. I think the reason why it's so difficult to measure things is that thinking and working in that experimental fashion are not very natural to us. It's hard work to think in those terms. But when we do it, that's how you can get to better outcomes, I think.
Thank you very much for the insightful answer, Dave. Any other answers?
Tough question. I don't know how to, you measure usage, you measure, I always tell people look for subjective and objective measures. You can measure what people do, you can measure, you can talk to them and see how they feel about what they're doing. But maybe the only other thing to point out, sorry, something stuck in my throat, Dave, there's always a nasty tension between user value and business value. You can add a feature to a product, and if we're talking about a commercial product, you can add a feature to Zoom that makes me like Zoom better, and I'll use that feature a lot. But it's hard to draw a direct correlation between renewals and that feature. Do people renew more? Does the company make more money as a consequence of that individual feature? If you use a product like Spotify, if I were to ask you which feature or which group of features make you renew Spotify and make you pay for it, the correlation between what's valuable to your business and what's valuable to users is a weak link. You can measure how frequently they use something, and we can make an assumption that if they use it, it must be valuable. But even that has flaws, based upon that kind of metric. Fire extinguishers are not very valuable because I seldom use them. In fact, I'm not sure I've ever used a fire extinguisher. So not even usage is a good key indicator of value. Anyway, but
and the other way around, people might use it and hate it.
yeah, exactly. And
my favorite did some work at a very large top-end medical devices company.
Mm-hmm.
And they had to add new features, even though they knew no one would use them, because they would get, I've got the new device, look, it warms me coffee, it does. They had to have this stuff that people could show off but never use, because that was part of that. And the real challenge is value is like beauty, it's in the eye of the beholder. So you can measure lots of these things, but how you interpret, you put some new features out and you get loads of sales. Was it because Elon Musk tweeted a joke about you, or was it because of the new features? Very hard to get.
There is, as Jeff and Ian say, that this is a very hard problem, and one of the reasons why there's no general answer to it, I think. But one of the aspects that you can kind of improve on it a bit is by making change in smaller steps, is because that narrows the amount of variance. As Ian says, if we put a huge bunch of changes into production and user sign-up goes up, which feature did that? We can't tell. Maybe it was my feature, maybe it was your feature. If we put features out in much smaller scale, at the limit, one at a time, we can at least see some of the impact of that. We're still guessing. We're still going to have to apply some careful, thoughtful analysis to understand the results. But we've controlled the variables a little bit further by reducing smaller features more frequently.
It's a great point. Thank you guys for the very insightful answers. I think we'll stop it there. We've had 15 minutes of audience Q&A. I just wanted to hand over to Ivar to see if he has anything to add at these closing stages.
Yeah, I think it was very interesting to get these answers to the questions. I must say I had a hard time to not jump in and be part of the discussion, but I succeeded. And there were so many things I would have liked to add, which is use cases of essence. For instance, I felt, Dave, when you talked about you should focus on the essentials. That's exactly what we try to do by using poker-sized cards to describe a practice. And there are other things we also do to focus on the essentials. And when essence itself doesn't tell you what to do, it has no practices embedded. It just has a number of aspects you want to pursue. Actually, there are 7 of them that we could find everybody could agree on. We had others, but then there were objections. And these aspects, or whatever you would call them, perspectives on a project, had states, so we can measure progress. That's what one aspect of use case. Another is that it actually tried to address this problem that we had today, namely, how do you choose between all these ideas, practices, techniques, and so on, that are all described in their own special way? That was the best that the author could come up with, maybe. How do you choose between? Is there a way to deal with it? Ian addressed that to some extent. And actually, we think this is such an interesting topic. So we will have a special meetup for that on October 25. Maybe you can maybe tell about it. But that is will be really interesting because it will try to address these problems. And I think we have not yet identified other participants, but maybe there is a way to invite the participants today in that meetup. We will discuss it. So anyway, I think it was a fantastic meetup. I think we should continue on the subject because it's a really important subject. How can you help people select what they need to use?